first of all, that French way of playing Inégalité, not in general all sort of unequal playing equally written values. Because in 18th century or 17th century we can speak in most of Europe about a praxis that musicians just played equally written notes unequal on different ways. So between Italy and England it was the same or not the same, but it was quite common not to play exactly what is written. So when we say inégalité, or today at least, we are going to speak most of all about French sort of 17th century, 18th century inégalité, and we are going to speak about the influence this French praxis made on other European countries and other European musicians. But we are not going to speak about those Italian violin players who probably played totally unequal anything they had in front of them written. We have a lot of documents from all Europe, so even from Spain, about sort of inégalité praxis, that they just played notes inégal, unequal, like many Italian sources speak about this, but it's not really detailed. So we have sources from Caccini and Frescobaldi saying that it is more elegant or more graceful to play something unequal and not like exactly written. Frescobaldi, so there are some harpsichord players here beside you, so it's well known in one of the forewords of the toccatas. I think it's written that you can play in Lombardic or unequal or so, but it is not exactly the same as French inégalité. And very often we see globally seen in the European sources that they say it's nicer to play something unequal because it's more graceful sounding, it's nicer, more elegant sounding. There is maybe one exception, one special case, is Germany, where we can very clearly see the influence of French praxis and French musicians on the German music and on the German way of performing music. So it is not just let's play a bit unequal, but it has something to do with French traditions, even it's not exactly that what French did at that time. But even Germans don't even say that it's exactly the same, they just say it's sort of inégalité what they do. So we must clarify first of all what we understand about that French sort of inégalité. It is first of all a matter of performance, of playing music. It's not a problem of the notation. For us it is more a notation problem, so we see some scores, French baroque music, and we have no single idea what to do with that. Yeah? And we heard something about inégalité, but the score doesn't give any information. So for us it's more a problem of notation. For them it was not that, and it was not a problem at all. For them it was the most obvious thing to play and to sing and to speak unequal. And it was and it should not be a sort of ad hoc performance, so it's not something we just decide whether to do or not to do. Yeah, it's not up to our decision. We can decide whether to play French baroque music or not, but if we play it's a part of the performance is playing Inegal. It's not written in the score, but it is part of the music. So it's not our matter of our mood or anything, decision. Even in France, they use the normal dotted rhythm, like 2 8 notes and 1 8 notes is with a dot, and the other one is a 16. So ti 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 ti. They had it like in all European countries, and they use it more or less on the same way as other nations. But it was some part of the performance which was not really possible to express with the normal well-known notation system, and they just didn't fix it. They didn't care about this because it was anyway obvious. So then why to make a more detailed notation, which was already complicated enough if you see any French Baroque score from the 18th century, and this is just a very simple one, so harpsichord and viola da gamba notation or even lute notation was much more complicated. So why to give additional information in the score when it was anyway obvious for the performance, for the performer? So dotted rhythm has existed, and of course when it's dotted, then there is no dot, it has to be dotted. We can discuss about how sharp is the rhythm, but it's another subject. The inégalité is sometimes written with dotted rhythms. So we must understand that there is no basic difference between the normal, let's say, normal way of inégalité and the written out dotted rhythms in French music. It's only just a slightly different, so that's just a little borderline where the composer decided that from this point on it makes no sense to give a precise notation for the rhythm, because anyway everybody knows what to do and how to do. Then we have a lot of rules written in French theoretical books and some German books in 17th, 18th century. I have very much the feeling that with the time we have more and more sources and more rules. So the very first sources are mid 17th century or even late 17th century, and towards mid 18th century there are more and more documents telling about inégalité. But I think it was just exactly the time when the inégalité started to die, and that's why we have more and more information about this, because it was not anymore that obvious, or there were situations when they were not using inégalité. But these rules are not real rules. For us, they work like rules how to do this, but for them it was just to document an alive praxis which was less and less alive, and it was really sort of dying out at that time, mid 18th century, and it's just to have something documented about this. Well, the next important point is to clarify that inégalité is basically a vocal thing, so a vocal phenomenon, and instrumental players borrowed it from vocalists. So when we speak about instrumental inégalité, we have always think about the origin of this, and we have to compare it to vocal music and to spoken language, not only vocal but spoken language. So we should never forget about drama and poesy in France, which was an extremely important thing. So Molière and Racine were the two important persons, maybe 17th century and later others. And not only theater pieces, but poesy had a very important role in the French culture, and even in the music, one part of the musical repertoire was based on very simple poems. There are a huge amount of little songs, airs with very stupid texts, and then just short and short phrases, very simple rhymes, nothing special, and with stupid music. We have bands of these left from this period. They really loved this, and it was for them just almost the same as telling a poem, so with some melody, but so basically it was a literal art of doing things. Maybe we can, when we mention this art, these short little airs, and sometimes it's called brunettes, or it has different names. Just one good example for this, how it sounds. And so on. So, but we have thousands of this sort, with a lot of verses and so endless. Yeah, this is a quite popular one. And what other arts they like very much in France? They like to dance very much. And dancing and inégalité has some connections too, but dance is not the source of inégalité, but it can be a result of the inégalité praxis. Basically, you cannot dance unequal because then you fall down. But there are some movements of the hand and some ornamentations you do with your legs and arms, which is coming from this unequal playing. They like dance music, and of course in dance music they applied inégalité. Yeah? But basically all the inégalité comes from the vocal music, not from dance. But it made some influence on the dance music. And then of course they loved opera. It was quite new in France at that time, so like one generation after Italy, it arrived to France via Lully, who was Italian in fact. That story everybody knows. But we waste basically much too little time for the theater, for the French theater, so they really loved theater, and it was even maybe more important than as opera. And just think about Lully's theater pieces. They are not real operas, so you have there the story of Molière's piece, usually most of cases, not only, but many cases, and then actors out, dancers in, and music starts, and then music over, actors in, and the story continues. So it was not really happening simultaneously. So they had some arias and so, but basically there were blocks of music and dance and prosa. Okay. And instrumental music, of course, but instrumental music was very, very much connected to dance music, at least at the beginning. And that's why, maybe that's one of the reasons why French instrumental music didn't develop as fast as Italian. So at least violinists did not get that good and that virtuosic as in Italy, because they had this very, very strong connection to the simple dance music. So Italian sort sonatas, and so they started to compose much later than in Italy or elsewhere in Europe. Instrumental music is, again, it's not the origin but the result of this inégalité tradition. And for example, special fingerings on the harpsichord are not the reason, not the origin of inégalité, but so it's not, how to say, you use special fingerings on harpsichord to reproduce inégalité, but it's not like this that you have a special fingering and because of this you receive inégalité. So you understand, it's not exactly the same. Anyway, it's possible to play with the most tricky fingerings even equally, so it's the same for the flute. We can use the most sophisticated French tonguing articulation, but still we can play equal if we want, but why should we? So, back to the sources, we said that until late 17th century we have almost no mentioning of inégalité, but of course inégalité has existed, and just it was obvious, and it was no big discussion how to do this and why to do this. From late 17th century on and towards mid 18th century, it's something very interesting. So in more and more instrumental methods we find mentioning of inégalité, but not like fifth chapter about inégalité. So it's never like this. They don't speak about inégalité like a separate subject. Most of cases we can see mentioning of inégalité in the chapter if there is about measure signs through 3 2 3 4 2 4 4 4 and so on and so on. It's very interesting because one of the very important harpsichord sources is Saint-Lambert. It's in that chapter when he's telling about the different measure signs, and one of the very important flute sources, or no, it's not really flute, but yeah, as Otteter was a flutist, we can treat it flute sources. That book by Otteter about playing preludes, yeah, and there is a chapter where I will show you later about the different measure signs, and there he gives very valuable information about inégalité, where to play, how to play, which sort of music you have to apply. Okay. And beside these, so when those methods speak about measure signs, then we see information about inégalité, and when they explain fingerings or tonguing, then saying that, for instance, Otteter in his flute method says that this ti 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 is very good because it gives us automatically the right manner of playing, which is a bit unequal or something like this, how he formulates. And the same you can find in keyboard methods in 18th century. Okay. In later music, like let's say very end of 17th century, beginning of 18th century, we see that in arias, opera arias, or chamber opera arias, or cantatas, or whatever, when vocal voice and an instrumental voice appears at the same time, then the vocal voice gives always the explanation for the instrumentalists how to play. So the instrumental parts are often just really not really detailed, and the instrumentalist had to listen to the singer and imitate, basically. So sometimes on the opposite way, sometimes it happened that especially in orchestra, that to be sure that the orchestra will play unequal, even a jumping motif, the composer has written out the dots. And in chamber music, a similar citation note. And so it's very, very interesting to see how this Inegal tradition appears when voice and instrumental parts are together. We will see some examples later. So, just very quickly about French language. What are the most important characteristics of the language? Yeah. So, like in all Latin languages, we have a quite strong rhythm and stressed and unstressed syllables and so on and so on. It's similar, but there is something very specific, that the syllables are slightly different. One is a bit shorter, the other is a bit longer, but not necessarily very long and very short. So the difference is not to express with relationships like 1 to 2 or 1 to 3, but often it's something in between. Yeah, and because of this, the normal notation of musical notation is not really good for this, if you want to write down perfectly how it sounds. Just a second. Okay. Okay, we might think that the language has not changed that much in last 200 or 300 years. We don't know how much and how it has changed. So there are tendencies of changing which it's easy or not that difficult to find out, but it's more about the pronunciation and less about the rhythm and the way of speaking. So there are linguistic methods to reconstruct language, how it has been sounding 300 years ago. We know more or less how Shakespeare's English is sounding, but it doesn't really help us, because what we want to understand how they were really speaking, and especially on the stage, in the theater, how they were speaking, because it has been always different of that what we normally speak. We have very, very old sound recordings of French theater pieces. We have a very famous recording where Sarah Bernhardt acts in a Racine piece. It's from 1902, I think. Something like this. It's the recording, so extremely early. And this is sort of really ridiculous, but interesting. Wait a second.
Celle qui monte les enfers, volage, adorateur, venu d'objet divers. Tu vas dire que j'aime mort, que j'en aurai la pousse. Mais si j'aime, mes fière et même c'est farouche, charmant, jeune. Traînant lecteur d'après-toi, quel beau défend aux yeux, celle que je vois. Il va de votre sang, vos yeux, votre langage. Cette noble figure colorait son visage. Sur le portrait qui traversait les flots, diffusait des jeux, des filles de l'autre. Et que faisiez-vous alors? Pourquoi sont-ils policiers au chagrin?
So it's quite extreme. But we cannot be sure that, okay, so there is about 100 years between us and Sir Bernard. If we add 200 more years backwards, and we think it was even 3 times more extreme in Racine's time, it's probably not that. We don't know, so we have descriptions about speaking on the stage from that time, but it's not enough information to imagine this. This sort of very extremely affektuiert in German, I don't know it in English, way of speaking. It's maybe it was sort of fashion, and then it changed and again changed. So we don't know. It's not enough to imagine how it was 300 years ago. But still, it is interesting to study this sort of very declamatory way of speaking. Even today's modern stage performances, how they speak in the modern theater, or even to study some old recordings. And I brought some other very nice example. It's Apollinaire telling one of his famous poems. I think this recording is quite known still. It's interesting to hear.
Le pont Mirabeau, où le pont Mirabeau coule la Seine, et nos amours, faut-il qu'ils m'en souviennent, la joie venait toujours après la peine. Vienne la nuit, sonne l'heure, les jours s'en vont, je demeure. Les mains dans les mains, restons face à face, tandis que sous le fond de nos bras passent les éternels regards longs de silence. Vienne la nuit, sonne l'heure, les jours s'en vont, je demeure. L'amour s'en va comme cette eau courante, l'amour s'en va comme la vie est lente, et comme l'espérance est violente. Vienne la nuit, sonne l'heure.
And so on and so on. But here it's very clearly to hear this Inegal way of speaking, a bit exaggerated even. And there are some very typical words which appearing always in all French texts and opera arias and poems, so which are typical situations where you sing or speak or play Inegal. It's l'amour, fatal, malheur. In all French arias you have at least one of them. So it's and it's always like this, that the first syllable is coming as the last tone in the bar, and the second one is coming as a first tone in the bar, and both are equally with equal values written out, and obviously you have to pronounce it like tirin, 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 and according to your instrument you have to choose the right fingering or whatever. And of course the composer doesn't need to write out the correct values of the notes, because everybody knows, yeah? And this everybody knows thing, so it made the story a bit difficult, maybe already that time. So sometimes composers had to take a decision. I didn't find, unfortunately, that one of my favorite examples in the Rameau opera in the Hippolyte Narisi, where it's a sort of, I don't know, arias or whatever. The bass, the basso continuo starts the aria, and it's written out with dotted rhythms, something like this. Yeah? And then 2 bars later, the soprano is coming and starts to sing with this motif. And I don't know the text. I couldn't. Yesterday night I was searching desperately, but didn't find. There are no dotted rhythms for the singer, because obviously she knows how to pronounce her own language. But because the basso continuo starts before and comes before, the continuo players didn't know exactly what the text will be. Mm-hmm. And for them, because it's a bigger group of players, and because it's repeated note, it's to avoid having any doubt and any question marks about the right performance, the composer has written out the dotted rhythm. But only because of this. If it would be a solo music for only one instrumentalist, then maybe he would not do that. So it's a borderline situation. Yeah? And so on and so on. We could find many of these sort of